The Man in the Passage by G.K. Chesterton. Two men entered at the same moment the narrow passage that runs along the side of the Apollo Theater in the Adelphi. The streets outside were flooded with the generous, weightless light of a setting sun. The passage itself was long and dim, and at the opposite end, each man could discern only the dark silhouette of the other. Yet, even by that black outline, they recognized each other instantly, for both were of a highly marked appearance, and they happened to hate each other bitterly. The narrow alley connected one of the steep streets of the Adelphi with the embankment overlooking the river, which reflected all the tints of the sunset sky. One side of the passage was formed by a windowless wall, the side of an old, somewhat shabby restaurant attached to the theater, which was closed at this hour. On the other side, at different ends of the passage, two doors opened. Neither was a common stage door. They were special entrances for elite performers. At this time, they were used by the actor and actress playing the leads in a Shakespearean play. Such personages often prefer a private entrance and exit, the better to receive friends or to avoid them. The two men in question were undoubtedly among such friends. The door at the start of the passage was well known to them, and both expected it to be unlocked, for each approached it from his own side with equal calm and confidence. However, the man coming from the far end of the alley walked more rapidly, and both reached the coveted door at the same instant. They exchanged a stiff, polite bow, hesitated for a second, and finally, the one who had walked faster, and who seemed of a less patient temperament, knocked. In this, as in all other things, they were complete opposites, yet neither could be said to be inferior to the other. In personal merit, both were handsome, gifted, and famous. In social standing, both occupied the highest rungs. Yet everything about them, from their fame to their features, was incomparable and distinct. Sir Wilson Seymour was one of those important figures whose weight in society is perfectly known to all insiders. The deeper you penetrate into the circles of lawyers, doctors, statesmen, and men of the liberal professions, the more often you encounter Sir Wilson Seymour. He was the only efficient person on dozens of inefficient committees, dealing with everything from the reform of the Royal Academy to the introduction of bimetallism for the further prosperity of an already prosperous Britain. In all matters concerning art, his power was boundless. His position was so unique that no one could tell if he was a great aristocrat patronizing art, or a great artist patronized by aristocrats. But after 5 minutes of conversation, you realized that, in essence, he had been commanding you your whole life. His appearance was equally remarkable, seemingly ordinary, yet somehow exceptional. The most fastidious critic could find no fault with his silk top hat, yet it was not like other hats, perhaps a trifle taller, adding just a bit to his stature. Tall and slender, he had a slight stoop, yet he did not seem frail. Quite the contrary. His silver-gray hair did not make him look old. He wore it slightly longer than was the fashion, but it did not seem feminine. It was wavy, but did not look curled. A pointed beard gave him a look of masculinity, much like the admirals in the somber Velázquez portraits that hung in his house. His gray gloves had a slightly bluer tint, and his silver-top cane was just a bit longer than the dozens of similar canes seen in theaters and restaurants. The second man was not as tall, yet no one would call him short. Rather, one would notice his sturdy build and handsome face. His hair was also curly, but fair and cropped short. His head was powerful and massive, the kind of head, as Chaucer said of his miller, that could break down a door. His military mustache and broad shoulders marked him as a soldier, though the piercing, open look in his blue eyes was more characteristic of a sailor. His face was almost square, his chin was square, his shoulders were square. Even his frock coat seemed square. Naturally, the extravagant school of caricaturists of that era did not miss their chance. Mr. Max Beerbohm had depicted him as a geometric figure from the fourth book of Euclid. For he, too, was a notable personality, though his success was of a different kind. One did not need to be in high society to have heard of Captain Cutler, the Siege of Hong Kong, or the famous Chinese campaign. Everyone talked about him. His portrait was on postcards, maps of his battles filled the illustrated magazines, and songs in his honor were heard in every music hall and on every barrel organ. His fame, though perhaps less enduring than Sir Wilson's, was far wider and more popular. In thousands of English homes, he was ranked as high as Nelson. And yet, Sir Wilson Seymour was immeasurably more influential. The door was opened by an old servant or dresser, whose sickly appearance and dark, worn clothes contrasted strangely with the glittering interior of the great actress's dressing room. The room was lined with numerous mirrors set at various angles. One might have mistaken them for the countless facets of a giant diamond, had anyone been able to crawl into its center. As the servant shuffled about, adjusting a mirror or pushing one against the wall, the other marks of luxury, flowers, colorful cushions, theatrical costumes, were multiplied infinitely, as in a fairy tale, dancing and shifting so that one's head began to swim. Both guests spoke to the shabbily dressed servant as an old acquaintance, calling him Parkinson, and inquired after his mistress, Miss Aurora Rome. Parkinson said she was in the other room, but would inform her immediately. A shadow passed over the faces of both visitors, for the second room belonged to the famous actor, Miss Aurora's partner, and she was the kind of woman one could not admire without a flare of jealousy. However, the inner door flew open at once, and Miss Aurora appeared. She arrived as she always did, not only on the stage, but in life. Silence itself seemed to erupt into applause, and well-deserved applause at that. Her fantastic silk attire, the color of a peacock's feather, shimmered with shifts of blue and green, colors that always fascinate children and aesthete alike. Her heavy, bright chestnut hair framed one of those magical faces that are dangerous to all men, but especially to the very young and the aging. Together with her partner, the celebrated American actor Isidore Bruno, she had created an extraordinarily poetic and fantastic interpretation of A Midsummer Night's Dream. She had emphasized the significance of Oberon and Titania. In other words, Bruno's importance and her own. Amidst the exquisite, ghostly scenery and in the mysterious dances, her green costume, resembling the polished wings of a dragonfly, perfectly conveyed the inscrutable, vanishing essence of the fairy queen. However, encountering her in the light of day, even a fading one, any man saw nothing but her face. She bestowed upon both men her radiant, enigmatic smile, a smile that kept so many at the same highly dangerous distance. From Cutler, she accepted flowers, tropical and as costly as his victories, and from Sir Wilson Seymour, she received a different kind of offering, presented later and more carelessly. His upbringing forbade any display of excessive zeal, and his conventional unconventionality prevented him from giving gifts as banal as flowers. He had come across a trifle, he said, an antique piece, a Greek dagger from the Credo-Mycenaean era. It might well have been worn in the days of Theseus and Hippolyta. Like all weapons of those legendary heroes, it was copper, but imagine still sharp enough to pierce anyone. The dagger had attracted him by its shape. It resembled a leaf and was as beautiful as a Greek vase. If this toy pleased Miss Rome, or proved useful for the play, he hoped that she— At that moment, the door to the adjoining room flew open, and a tall man appeared on the threshold. He was an even greater contrast to the preoccupied Seymour than Captain Cutler. 6.5 feet tall, powerful, with every muscle on display, dressed in a magnificent leopard skin and the golden-brown robes of Oberon. Isidore Bruno looked truly like a pagan god. He leaned upon a kind of hunting spear. From the stage it appeared to be a light, silvery wand, but in the small, crowded room it gave the impression of a real and formidable weapon. Bruno's lively black eyes flashed fiercely, and his handsome, bronze-dark face, with its high cheekbones and dazzling white teeth, recalled the American rumors that he originated from the southern plantations. "Aurora," he began, in a voice as deep and sonorous as a drumbeat, filled with the passion that had so often shaken the theater hall. "Could you not—" Then he stopped in hesitation, for another man suddenly appeared in the doorway, a figure so out of place that it was almost laughable. A small man in the black cassock of a Catholic priest, he looked, especially beside Bruno and Aurora, like a crudely carved wooden Noah from a toy ark. However, he himself seemed not to feel the incongruity of his presence, and said with tedious politeness, "Miss Rome, I believe, wished to see me." A keen observer would have noticed that this dispassionate intrusion only made the passions in the room burn hotter. The detachment of the priest, bound by his vow of celibacy, suddenly made the others realize they had surrounded Aurora like a ring of jealous rivals. It was as when a man enters in a frost-covered coat. Everyone suddenly notices that the room is stiflingly hot. The arrival of the priest, who harbored no romantic feelings for Miss Rome, made her feel even more acutely that all the others were in love with her, each in his own dangerous way. The actor with the greed of a savage and a spoiled child. The soldier with the frank egoism of a nature used to action rather than reflection. Sir Wilson with that growing absorption with which hedonists indulge their favorite hobby. And even that Nanninity Parkinson, who had known her before she was famous, even. He followed her with a dog-like, adoring gaze. The keen observer might also have noticed something even stranger. And the little man, looking like a black wooden Noah, for he was not lacking in discernment, noticed it with considerable but suppressed amusement. The beautiful Aurora, who was by no means indifferent to the adoration of the other half of the human race, clearly wished to rid herself of all her admirers and remain alone with the one who was not her admirer, at least, not in the sense the others were. For the little priest, in his own way, certainly respected her and even admired the decisive, purely feminine skill with which she set to work. If there was one thing Aurora truly understood, it was the other half of the human race. Like a Napoleonic campaign, the little priest watched the swift unerringness with which she dismissed them all without actually turning anyone out. The famous actor Bruno was so childish that it was easy to offend him, and he left, slamming the door. Cutler, the British officer, was thick-skinned and not overly bright, but impeccable in his behavior. He would not take a hint, but he would rather die than fail to carry out a lady's request. As for Seymour, he had to be handled differently. He had to be sent away last. There was only one way to influence him, to speak to him confidentially as an old friend and involve him in the matter. The priest was truly delighted by how skillfully, with one clever maneuver, Miss Rome managed to show all three the door. She approached Captain Cutler and spoke to him most charmingly. These flowers are dear to me, for they must be your favorites. You know, the bouquet is not complete without my own favorites. Please go to the shop around the corner and bring some lilies of the valley. Then it will be quite lovely." The first goal of her diplomacy was achieved. The infuriated Bruno left at once. He had already managed to majestically hand his spear to the wretched Parkinson, as if it were a scepter, and was just about to settle into a chair, as if it were a throne. But at such a clear preference given to his rival, a flash of the resentment of a quick-to-offend slave appeared in his inscrutable eyes. His huge, dark fists clenched. He dashed to the door, flung it open, and vanished into his own apartments. Meanwhile, setting the British Army in motion proved not quite as simple as Miss Aurora had imagined. Cutler, of course, rose resolutely at once, and, just as he was, bareheaded, marched toward the door like a soldier on command. But something, perhaps some studied elegance in the pose of Seymour, who leaned lazily against one of the mirrors, suddenly stopped Cutler on the threshold, and like a puzzled bulldog, he began to turn his head uneasily. "I must show this blockhead where to go," Aurora whispered to Seymour, and hurried to the door to hasten the departing guest. Without changing his elegant and seemingly nonchalant pose, Seymour appeared to be listening. He heard Aurora shout her final instructions after Cutler, then turned sharply and, laughing, run toward the other end of the passage that opened onto the street above the Thames. Seymour breathed a sigh of relief, but a moment later his face clouded again. He had so many rivals, and the door at that end of the passage led to Bruno's room. Without losing his dignity, Seymour addressed a few polite words to Father Brown, something about the revival of Byzantine architecture in Westminster Cathedral, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, strolled toward the far end of the passage. Now only Father Brown and Parkinson remained in the room, and neither was inclined toward idle conversation. The dresser moved about the room, shifting the mirrors to and fro. His dark, threadbare frock coat and trousers seemed all the more dismal because he held in his hands the magical spear of King Oberon. Every time he turned another mirror, another figure of Father Brown appeared. In that absurd room of glass, the place was full of Father Browns. They soared in the air like angels, tumbled like acrobats, and turned their backs to one another like the rudest of strangers. Father Brown seemed not to notice this invasion of witnesses. As if having nothing better to do, he followed Parkinson with a steady gaze until the man vanished with his preposterous spear into Bruno's room. Then the priest surrendered himself to the abstract reflections that always gave him pleasure, calculating the angle of the mirrors, the angle of each reflection, the angle at which each glass met the wall, when suddenly he heard a loud, instantly stifled cry. He sprang up and stood frozen, listening. In the same breath, Sir Wilson Seymour burst into the room, white as a sheet. "Who is in the passage?" he cried. "Where is my dagger?" Before Father Brown could even turn in his heavy boots, Seymour was darting around the room in search of the weapon. And before he could find the dagger or any other defense, the sound of running feet thudded on the pavement outside, and Cutler's square face appeared in the doorway. His hand absurdly clutched a bouquet of lilies of the valley. "What is it?" he shouted. "What was that thing in the passage? More of your tricks." "My tricks," hissed his pale rival, stepping toward him. Meanwhile, Father Brown stepped out into the passage, looked toward the other end, and walked rapidly in that direction. The other two immediately ceased their quarreling and followed him, Cutler shouting, "What are you doing? Who are you?" "My name is Brown," the priest answered sadly. He stooped over something and then straightened up at once. Miss Rome sent for me. I came as fast as I could, and he was too late." The three men looked down, and in the evening light, for at least one of them, life had ended. The light stretched in a golden path down the passage, and in the middle of that path lay Aurora Rome. Her brilliant green attire shimmered with gold, and her dead face was turned upward. Her dress was torn as if in a struggle, exposing her right shoulder, but the wound from which the blood poured was on the other side. The copper dagger, faintly glinting, lay about a yard from the body. For a moment, silence reigned. From a distance, beyond Charing Cross, the laugh of a flower girl could be heard, and on a street leading to the Strand, someone whistled impatiently for a taxi. Then suddenly, the captain, whether in a fit of genuine rage or a pretense of it, seized Wilson Seymour by the throat. Seymour did not flinch or try to free himself. He only looked the man in the eye. "There is no need to kill me," he said impassively. "I shall do that myself." The hand at his throat loosened and dropped. Seymour added with the same icy frankness, "If I lack the heart to stab myself with that dagger, I shall drink myself to death in a month." "No, wine is not enough for me," Cutler said. "Before I die, someone shall pay for her death in blood. Not you, but I think I know who." And before they could grasp his intent, he snatched up the dagger, dashed to the second door, burst it open, and flew into Bruno's dressing room, confronting the actor face to face. At that moment, old Parkinson came out of the room with his shambling, unsteady gait. Seeing the corpse, he staggered closer, his face twitching. Then he tottered back into Bruno's room and suddenly sank onto the cushions of a plush armchair. Father Brown ran to him, ignoring Cutler and the giant actor, who were already struggling for the dagger, their fists thudding against each other in the echoing room. Seymour, retaining a shred of common sense, stood at the end of the alley and whistled for the police. When the officers arrived, they had to pull apart the two men who were clinging to each other like apes. After a few formal questions, they arrested Isidore Bruno, whom his furious adversary accused of murder. The thought that a national hero had apprehended the criminal with his own hands was undoubtedly convincing to the police, who are, in some ways, kin to journalists. They treated Cutler with respectful gravity and noted a small wound on his hand. While Cutler was dragging Bruno over an overturned table and chair, the actor had managed to snatch the dagger and strike him below the wrist. The wound was a mere scratch, but until the frenzied prisoner was led away, he stared at the trickling blood with a lingering smile. A villain if ever there was one. A constable remarked confidentially to Cutler. Cutler did not answer, but after a moment he said sharply, "We must attend to the dead woman." His voice broke. The last word was almost silent. To the two dead, the priest replied from the far corner of the room, "This poor fellow was already dead when I reached him." Father Brown stood looking at old Parkinson, who sat like a black, formless heap in a luxurious chair. He, too, had paid his tribute to the deceased, and had done so eloquently enough. Cutler was the first to break the silence, a touch of gruff tenderness in his voice. "I envy him," he said hoarsely. "I remember how he always followed her with his eyes. He breathed through her, and now there is no air. So he died. We are all dead," Seymour said in a strange voice, staring out at the street. At the corner, they bid farewell to Father Brown, offering a brusque apology for the violence he had witnessed. Their faces were tragic and mysterious. The little priest's mind always resembled a rabbit warren. The wildest, most unexpected thoughts darted so quickly he could hardly catch them. Like the vanishing white tail of a rabbit, The thought flashed through his mind that while their grief was certain, their innocence was far more doubtful. "We had better all leave," Seymour said with an effort. "We have done our best to help." "Will you understand me," Father Brown asked in a low voice, "if I say that you have done your best to hurt?" Both men started as if pricked by an uneasy conscience, and Cutler asked sharply, "To hurt? Whom?" "Yourselves," answered the priest. "I would not add to your grief, but it would be simply unjust not to warn you. If this actor is acquitted, you have done everything possible to put yourselves in the way of the gallows. I shall be called as a witness, and I shall have to say that when the cry was heard, both of you rushed like madmen into the actress's room and fought over the dagger. Based on my evidence, either of you could have killed her. You have damaged your own case, and Captain Cutler has further damaged his hand with the blade." "Damage my hand?" Captain Cutler exclaimed with scorn. "It is a mere scratch." "But it bled," the priest countered with a nod. "There are bloodstains on the dagger now, that we know, but we shall never know if there was blood on it before." There was a silence. Then Seymour spoke with an agitation quite unlike his usual manner. "But I saw a man in the passage." "I know," said Father Brown with an impenetrable face. "And Captain Cutler saw him too. That is precisely what seems so improbable." And before they could grasp his meaning or offer any rebuttal, he apologized politely, picked up his clumsy old umbrella, and trudged heavily away. In modern newspapers, everything is arranged so that the most important and reliable reports come from the police. If more space is given to a murder in the 20th century than to politics, there are sound reasons for it. Murder is a much more serious matter. Yet even this hardly explains the immense notoriety achieved by the Bruno case, or the mystery of the passage, and its exhaustive coverage in the London and provincial press. The excitement gripped the entire country, and for a few weeks, the papers spoke the plain truth. The reports of the examinations and cross-examinations, though monstrously long and sometimes impossible, were at least trustworthy. The reason, of course, lay in the names involved. The victim was a popular actress, the accused a popular actor, and the accused had been caught, so to speak, at the scene of the crime by the most popular soldier of this patriotic age. Under such extraordinary circumstances, the press had to be honest and precise. Thus, the remainder of this singular story can be told from the official records of the Bruno trial. The trial was presided over by Judge Monkhouse, one of those men who are mocked as light-minded, but who are actually far more serious than serious judges. Their lightness is born of an undying intolerance for the gloomy solemnity inherent in the judicial clan. A serious judge is, in essence, frivolous, for he is filled with vanity. Since the principal actors were so well known, the prosecutor and the defense counsel were chosen with particular care. Sir Walter Cowdray, a somber but respected guardian of the law, acted for the prosecution, one of those men who know how to project the image of a true Englishman while inspiring perfect confidence and avoiding excessive eloquence. Defending the prisoner was Mr. Patrick Butler, K.C. Those who did not understand the Irish character, and those whom he had never cross-examined, mistakenly took him for a flaneur. The medical evidence offered no contradictions. The doctor summoned by Seymour to examine the body on sight agreed with the famous surgeon who examined it later. Aurora Rome had been struck by some sharp object, probably a knife or a dagger. At any rate, an instrument with a short blade. The blow had struck the heart, and death had been instantaneous. When the doctor first saw her, she had been dead for no more than 20 minutes. This meant that Father Brown had reached her about 3 minutes after her death. Then the official inquest findings were read. They primarily concerned whether a struggle had preceded the murder. The only sign of a struggle was the torn dress at the shoulder, but it had not been torn in a manner consistent with the direction and force of the blow. After these details were reported but not explained, the first important witness was called. Sir Wilson Seymour gave his evidence, as he did everything, not merely well, but superbly. A more prominent figure than even the royal judge, he nevertheless maintained an appropriate measure of modesty. Although everyone stared at him as if he were the Prime Minister or the Archbishop of Canterbury, he conducted himself as a private individual, albeit one with a great name. Furthermore, he spoke with remarkable clarity, as he did in all the committees on which he sat. He had gone to the theater to visit Miss Rome, had met Captain Cutler there, and they'd been joined briefly by the accused, who later returned to his dressing room. Additionally, they were joined by a Catholic priest named Brown. Then Miss Rome had stepped from her room into the passage to show Captain Cutler the way to a flower shop, as he was to buy her more flowers. The witness himself remained in the room and exchanged a few words with the priest. He then distinctly heard the deceased, having sent Captain Cutler away, turn and run laughing toward the other end of the passage, where the accused dressing room was located. Out of idle curiosity regarding the swift movements of his friends, the witness also went to that end of the alley and looked toward the accused door. Did he see anything in the passage? Yes, he did. Sir Walter Cowdray allowed for an impressive pause, while the witness stood with downcast eyes, appearing paler than usual despite his self-possession. Finally, the prosecutor asked in a low voice, both sympathetic and chilling, "Did you see it clearly?" However agitated Sir Wilson Seymour might have been, his magnificent brain worked flawlessly. As to the outline, very clearly. As to everything else, not at all. The passage is so long that against the bright background of the opposite exit, anyone standing in the middle appears as a mere black silhouette. The witness, who had been looking steadily at the prosecutor, lowered his eyes again and added, "I noticed this earlier, when Captain Cutler first appeared in the passage." Another brief silence followed. The judge leaned forward and made a note. "And so," Sir Walter continued insistently, "what was this silhouette? Was it not like, shall we say, the figure of the deceased?" "Not in the least," Seymour answered calmly. "What was it like, then?" "It was like a tall man. Everyone in the courtroom stared at something, be it the arm of a chair, an umbrella, a book, or their own boots, anywhere but at the prisoner. It seemed they had made it their goal not to look at the accused, yet everyone felt his presence in the dock, and to everyone he seemed a giant. Bruno's immense height was immediately striking, but the moment one looked away, he seemed to grow even more formidable with every passing second. Cowdray, somberly magnificent, smoothed his black silk gown and his white, silky side whiskers, and sat down. Sir Wilson answered a few more questions regarding details known to other witnesses and was already leaving the stand when the defense counsel sprang up and stopped him. "I shall detain you for only a moment," said Mr. Butler. In appearance, he seemed a bit of a rustic, with red eyebrows and a somewhat sleepy face. "Would you tell his lordship how you knew it was a man?" A shadow of a refined smile flitted across Seymour's face. "I beg your pardon. The matter was decided by so vulgar a detail as trousers," he said. "When I saw the light between the long legs, I realized at last that it was a man." Butler's sleepy eyes suddenly snapped open. It was like a silent explosion. "At last," he repeated slowly. "So, at first, you actually thought it was a woman? For the first time?" Seymour's composure failed him. "It hardly seems relevant to the case, but if his lordship wishes me to speak of my impression, I shall, of course, do so," he replied. The silhouette was not exactly feminine, but it was, as it were, not masculine either. The curves were wrong, and it had something like long hair. "Thank you," said Mr. Butler, K.C., and sat down abruptly, as if he had heard exactly what he wanted. Captain Cutler, as a witness, possessed far less self-control and inspired much less confidence than Sir Wilson, but his account of the initial events fully coincided with Seymour's. The captain told how Bruno had gone to his room, how he himself had been sent for lilies of the valley, how, returning to the passage, he saw someone there and suspected Seymour, and finally, of his struggle with Bruno. But he could not expressively describe the black figure that both he and Seymour had seen. When asked what the mysterious silhouette was like, he replied that he was no judge of art, a response that carried an almost too blatant sneer at Seymour. When asked whether it was a man or a woman, he replied that it looked most like a beast, and in his answer was a naked malice toward the accused. Yet, he was clearly beside himself with grief and unfeigned rage, and Cowdray did not detain him or force him to confirm already clear facts. The defense counsel, as in Seymour's case, did not prolong the cross-examination, though it seemed, such was his manner, that he was in no hurry at all. "You used a very strange expression," he said, looking sleepily at Cutler. "What did you mean when you said that the unknown person looked neither like a woman nor a man, but like a beast?" Cutler seemed genuinely agitated. "Perhaps I shouldn't have put it that way," he answered. "That brute has powerful, hunched shoulders like a chimpanzee, and on his head, bristles standing up like a pig's." Mr. Butler interrupted this strangely irritated speech mid-sentence. "Never mind the pig. Tell us instead, could it have looked like a woman's hair?" "A woman's," exclaimed the captain. "Not in the least. The previous witness said it did." The defense counsel caught him up quickly, shamelessly dropping his mask of a sleepy dullard. "And that the outlines of the figure had feminine curves, as was so eloquently hinted here." "No? No feminine curves? If I understand you correctly, the figure was rather thick-set and squat. Perhaps he was walking stooped," the captain uttered in a hoarse, barely audible voice. "And perhaps not," said Mr. Butler, and sat down as suddenly as the first time. The third witness called by Sir Walter Cowdray was the little Catholic priest, so small compared to the others that his head barely showed above the ledge. It seemed as if a small child were being cross-examined. Unfortunately, Sir Walter had somehow imagined, perhaps due to the faith his own family held, that Father Brown was on the side of the accused, for the accused was an ungodly man, a stranger, and moreover, had Negro blood in him. And he sharply cut Father Brown off whenever this arrogant emissary of the Pope tried to explain anything, ordering him to answer only yes or no, and to state only facts without any Jesuitry. When Father Brown, in the simplicity of his heart, began to explain who he thought the man in the passage was, the prosecutor declared he did not wish to hear his conjectures. A dark silhouette was seen in the passage. "And you say you saw a dark silhouette too. So what was it like?" Father Brown blinked as if he had received a reprimand, but he had long and well known the meaning of obedience. "The silhouette was short and thick-set," he said. "On either side of the head, or on the crown, were two sharp black elevations like horns and—" "Ah, I see, a horned devil," Cowdray exclaimed with cheerful triumph, and sat down. The devil himself arrived to devour the Protestants. "No," the priest countered dispassionately. "I know who it was. An inexplicable but distinct foreboding of something monstrous gripped everyone present. They had already forgotten the prisoner and remembered only the one scene in the passage. And that being in the passage, described by three sensible and respected witnesses, seemed to have stepped out of a nightmare. One saw a woman, another a beast, and the third a devil. The judge looked at Father Brown with a cold, piercing gaze. "You are a very strange witness," he said. "There is something in you that compels me to believe you are trying to tell the truth. So, who was the man you saw in the passage?" "It was myself," Father Brown replied. In the extraordinary silence, Mr. Butler, K.C., sprang up and said quite calmly, "Your lordship, allow me to examine the witness." And he immediately fired a question at Brown that seemed irrelevant. "You have already heard the mention of a dagger. The experts believe the crime was committed with a short blade. Are you aware of this?" "A short blade," Brown confirmed, nodding with somber gravity like an owl. "A very long handle." Before the courtroom could fully abandon the thought that the priest had seen with his own eyes how he himself plunged a short blade with a long handle into the victim, which made the murder seem even more hideous, he hurried to explain. "I mean to say, short blades are not found only on daggers. A spear also has a short blade, and a spear strikes just like a dagger if it is one of those fancy theatrical spears. It was with such a spear that poor Parkinson killed his wife, on the very day she had sent for me to settle their domestic troubles, and I arrived too late, God forgive me. But as he lay dying, he repented, and it was that repentance that brought on his death. He could not bear what he had done. To everyone in the room, it seemed that the little priest standing on the witness stand and talking utter nonsense had simply gone mad. But the judge continued to stare at him with the liveliest interest, and the defense counsel imperturbably asked his questions. "If Parkinson killed her with that theatrical spear, he must have thrown it from a distance of 4 yards, said Butler. "How then do you explain the signs of a struggle? The torn dress on the shoulder?" The defense counsel had involuntarily begun to address the witness as an expert, but no one noticed it anymore. "The unfortunate woman's dress was torn because it caught in a door leaf as she ran past," said the witness. "She was trying to wrench the dress free, and at that moment, Parkinson came out of the prisoner's room and struck the blow." "A door leaf?" the prosecutor repeated in surprise. "It was the leaf of a door disguised as a mirror," Father Brown explained. "When I was in Miss Rome's dressing room, I noticed that some of the mirrors evidently served as secret doors leading into the passage." Again, there was a long, improbably deep silence. This time, it was broken by the judge. "So, you truly believe that when you looked into the passage, you saw yourself in a mirror?" "Yes, my lord. That is exactly what I was trying to explain," Brown replied. "But I was asked what the silhouette was like, and on our hats, the corners look like horns, so I—" The judge leaned forward, his old eyes gleaming even more brightly, and he said with great distinctness, "Do you really believe that when Sir Wilson Seymour saw something absurd? What was it? With curves, feminine hair, and trousers, he was seeing Sir Wilson Seymour." "Yes, my lord," Father Brown answered. "And you believe that when Captain Cutler saw a hunched chimpanzee with pig's bristles on its head, he was simply seeing himself?" "Yes, my lord." The judge, highly pleased, leaned back in his chair. It was difficult to tell whether there was more mockery or admiration in his face. "And tell me, why did you manage to recognize yourself in the mirror, while two such eminent men failed to do so?" he asked. Father Brown blinked, even more confusedly than before. "I really don't know, my lord," he stammered, "unless it is because I don't look in the mirror very often."